You usually think of your soul as something locked deep inside your own mind, right? Like something entirely private, just pulsing away quietly behind your eyes.
Right, yeah, like it's trapped in your skull.
Exactly. But what if your soul is actually out there? I mean, what if it's lingering in the damp alleyway behind your apartment, or in that disposable styrofoam cup sitting on your desk, or, baked right into the repetitive architecture of your office building?
It completely upends how we experience ourselves, honestly.
Mhm.
We are so heavily conditioned by our culture to look inward. Like if you feel empty, you look inside. But today, we're doing the exact opposite. We're looking out the window.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. Today, we're jumping into the radically brilliant mind of the renegade psychologist James Hillman. Specifically, we're looking at excerpts from his rounds called City and Soul.
Which is volume 2 of the uniform edition of his work, just for context.
Right. And the goal here is to completely flip how you view your own psychology, your city, and really your physical connection to the world around you.
Okay, let's unpack this. So, to really grasp what Hillman is doing, we have to look at what mainstream psychotherapy has been up to for, well, the last 100 years or so.
Since Freud, basically.
Since Freud and Jung, yeah.
Yeah.
The standard default has been to trap the soul inside the consulting room. We've built this entire multi-billion-dollar culture around the idea that psychological problems are purely internal mechanics.
Like it's just bad wiring in your brain.
Exactly. If you're struggling, the problem is your brain chemistry, or maybe your childhood trauma, or personal relationships. But Hillman steps in and says, absolutely not. The soul is not confined to your skull, and it definitely isn't confined to a 50-minute therapy session. He wants to literally release the soul back out into the streets.
Which brings us right to the city itself. Usually when city planners or politicians talk about cities, they view them as this giant list of abstract problems that need solving.
Oh, for sure. It's all about traffic congestion and zoning laws.
Right, waste disposal routes, spreadsheets. It's infrastructure. They essentially treat the city like a giant plumbing system.
And treating it that way completely strips the city of its humanity. Hillman draws heavily on the urban historian Lewis Mumford here. Mumford made this beautiful argument that the city is actually the greatest of all human works of art.
An act of imagination.
Yes, a massive, living, breathing act of collective imagination. A city isn't a machine, but because we treat our urban spaces merely as functional problems, we end up building incredibly soulless environments.
This reminds me of the Italo Calvino reference in the text, the fictional city of Trude.
Trude is the ultimate nightmare of modern urban planning.
Yeah, in Calvino's story, Trude is a city that has completely conquered the globe. Like you fly in and out, but the entire world is covered by this one identical city.
Right. The airport is the exact same everywhere you land. The only thing that changes is the name on the giant neon sign. It's an environment built purely for transient efficiency. There's no local flavor, no friction, no history.
And because it lacks character, it completely lacks a soul. It's basically sensory deprivation disguised as convenience.
Exactly. And you contrast that sterile efficiency with the romantic, almost erotic intimacy of a real historic city.
Oh, like Ezra Pound's famous poem set in the Paris metro. The one about the apparition of these spaces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough.
Yes. There is a deep, sudden emotional resonance there. A soulful city isn't just a grid that moves you from point A to point B as fast as possible. It has traditional markers of psychological depth. And those markers are physical. They are built right into the landscape.
So a soulful city has twisting, dark alleyways. And why do those matter? Because a dark, winding alley forces you to slow down. It feels mysterious.
It isn't perfectly illuminated and sterilized, right?
Right. And a soulful city has cemeteries or old war memorials that literally anchor emotional memory right into the dirt. And crucially, it has places specifically designed for eye-level human contact.
Those eye-level spaces are so vital. Think about a crowded sidewalk cafe, or the water cooler at a slightly dysfunctional office building, or even a classic lover's lane in Dallas.
Yeah, that is where the psychological life of the city actually happens.
That's where the gossip takes place, where people pause, flirt, argue, connect. Without those friction-filled eye-level spaces, a city is just a machine we are forced to operate inside of.
It really makes me think about how we navigate modern life. When you drive on a massive 8-lane freeway, how are you navigating? You're looking at these giant, abstract, green highway signs hanging up in the sky.
Which requires only your head.
Exactly. You're just decoding letters and numbers at 70 miles an hour. But if you walk through a historic town, you navigate by actual physical images. You turn left at the hangman's tree, you go right when you see the sign of the Red Ox.
Right, navigating by local images gives you a bodily, soulful orientation.
Yeah.
You aren't floating, you are physically present in the space.
It's the difference between existing in a mathematical space versus living in a deeply imaginal space. But if we accept this, if the city is a living thing with its own soul, what happens when the city gets sick?
Oh man, this is where Hillman drops a complete bomb on the whole therapy industry. He revives this ancient concept called the anima mundi, which translates directly to the soul of the world.
Okay.
Now, mainstream modern psychology operates on a Cartesian worldview. That's René Descartes, who basically claimed that human beings have minds, but the outside world is just dead matter.
Just a bunch of atoms bumping into each other.
Dead stuff, exactly. So under that model, if someone is chronically depressed or a marriage is failing, traditional therapy looks only at the individuals. It assumes the human is the only entity in the room capable of having a pathology.
But Hillman argues that the world itself is having a nervous breakdown. And I love how he uses clinical psychological terms to describe structural things. It's brilliant.
It really is. Like he says, modern corporate buildings are anorexic.
Right, because they are skinny, bare-boned, glassy, and cold. They've been trimmed of all architectural fat. They refuse to take up visual space warmly.
And he calls corporate businesses paranoid, with their endless security cameras, badges, key cards, always defending against their own employees. He even calls modern agriculture addictive.
Because it constantly needs a higher dose of chemical fertilizers just to get a baseline yield, completely exhausting the soil. It's literally caught in a cycle of addiction.
It really is.
Okay, wait. I need to push back on this for a second.
Yeah.
Because I want to make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. I get the poetic metaphor. Calling a skyscraper anorexic makes for great writing. But if I'm stressed out while sitting in traffic or staring at a blank wall in a fluorescent-lit cubicle, therapy tells me that's my internal issue.
Right, you need better coping skills.
Yeah, exactly. But Hillman is suggesting the building is actually sick. And this concrete environment is literally projecting its sickness onto me. How does architecture cause a psychological symptom?
It's a totally fair challenge. But think about how your body reacts to space. If you're placed in a room with no windows, humming fluorescent lights, and completely blank walls, your nervous system reacts to that deprivation.
I mean, yeah, I'd feel terrible.
Right, you aren't projecting your internal neurosis onto the room. The room is starved of life, and that unacknowledged suffering of a soulless physical space is inundating you. You are feeling the breakdown of your environment.
Oh, wow.
If you gaze only into the mirror of self-reflection, trying to find what's wrong with your own brain, you fall into a trap. You end up taking on the burden of the world's sickness as if it were your own personal failure.
When you put it like that, it's actually an incredible relief. It's not all my fault. But the text mentions that therapy fiercely resists this idea.
What's fascinating here is how Hillman points out that therapy has developed an immunological defense against politics and architecture and the physical world.
By insisting all problems are purely internal.
Exactly. It protects itself from having to actually deal with the toxic world right outside the window. But the soul of the world is screaming for attention. And because therapy aggressively ignores the world's suffering, the therapy itself starts to break down and generate its own weird symptoms.
This part of the text was hilarious, but also so subversive. Hillman points to the hushed problems therapists complain about, like the analyst suddenly falling asleep in the middle of a session, literal narcolepsy.
Or the cliche of the analyst and patient falling desperately in love.
Right. Or this intense addiction to the schedule where time is chopped into rigid 50-minute blocks. Hillman says these aren't just personal failings of a bad therapist. These are symptoms generated by the therapy itself because it's trying to break out of its own narcissistic prison.
Yes. Psychoanalysis has a term called object libido. It basically means our natural human hunger to connect with the outside world. In a sterile therapy room, that object libido is so starved that it malfunctions. It either puts you to sleep to escape the sensory void, or it fixates intensely on the only other living thing in the room, the patient.
The system is sick because it severed itself from the anima mundi.
Precisely.
Which begs the question, if isolating ourselves and looking in the mirror is a trap, how do we shift our gaze out the window? How do we reconnect?
To do that, we have to completely dismantle the myth of the isolated lone hero. We love the idea of the strong, independent ego pulling itself up by its bootstraps. But to break that down, Hillman brings in this gorgeous metaphor of the traditional Japanese strolling garden.
This was easily one of the most vivid images for me.
In a Japanese garden, there is no single central place to stand and view everything at once. No God view. You must stroll. You have to physically move and shift your perspective constantly. And as you walk, you notice the trees.
They aren't grown to be towering, solitary oaks.
No, they're pruned specifically to grow sideways, reaching out toward the other trees. It botanically demonstrates that true individuality only exists within a community.
And the garden doesn't just celebrate pristine perfection either. The sources mention how they actively support dead or broken trees. They prop them up with visible wooden crutches and keep them as part of the landscape.
It completely crushes our obsession with everything needing to be young and fiercely independent. The garden says you are supported by the community even when you are broken. You belong here.
And this community isn't just made up of physical people standing next to you, right? It extends into the imaginal realm. The text shares this harrowing story of Mr. Liu King.
The Chinese dissident.
Yeah. He spent 11 years in a prison in Shaanxi province, and for years he was subjected to intense torture. Forced to sit on a tiny 8-inch wooden stool for up to 13 hours a day, just staring at a blank wall.
And the authorities constantly offered him an easy way out.
Yeah.
Just sign a fake confession saying he made mistakes in his thinking. It wouldn't even implicate anyone else. Just sign the paper and the agony ends.
But he refused.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Why did he refuse? Traditional psychology would say, well, he had a strong superego or a heroic ego center.
But that's not what kept him going.
Not at all. Liu King said that whenever he reached his breaking point, he would imagine the authorities bringing that piece of paper to his cell. And in that imaginal space, he felt the heavy presence of his waiting wife. He felt the presence of his imprisoned mentor, Mr. Wei. He felt his ancestors, his ideals.
He couldn't sign it because his imaginal community wouldn't permit the betrayal. His self was not a solitary unit holding the line. His self was the interiorization of his entire community.
It's like comparing the traditional view of the self to a silent monk meditating on a mountain, completely detached. But Hillman's definition of the self is more like a crowded, noisy dinner party.
Filled with your mentors, ancestors, maybe characters from books. You're never actually alone.
But to cultivate that rich community, we have to protect our imagination. And to do that, we have to give the imagination what it craves most, which is silence.
Right, which sounds like a contradiction after talking about a noisy dinner party. But this brings us to how we treat our imagination day to day, especially with our own dreams or raw thoughts. Our modern obsession with rational interpretation actively destroys the imagination.
Hillman uses a brilliant play on the Miranda rights here.
He argues that in the therapy room, anything you say can and will be used against you.
Yes, because the exact moment you share a vulnerable image, the therapist wants to analyze it. Let's take the specific example from the text. You remember a dream about a black snake. It's cold, coiled up, wanting to get closer to you for warmth.
If you tell that to a traditional therapist, they might say, the snake represents a mother problem, or it's a manifestation of your death anxiety.
And in doing so, they have violently killed the living snake. They took a vivid image and replaced it with a clinical concept. The cold snake is now just a file folder labeled problem. Explaining it drains all the mystery and vitality out of it.
And the political stakes of this are massive. Silence breeds imagination, and democracy inherently relies on an imagining agent. Hillman sees things like dyslexia and illiteracy not just as biological failures, but as symptoms of a culture that has lost its imagination.
We've replaced daydreaming with pure data processing.
Exactly. And think about how psychopathy is defined clinically. It is the inability to imagine the internal life of the other. If we kill the imagination by explaining it away, we're educating a society of sociopaths who can't imagine what it feels like to be someone else. This raises an important question, though.
It really does. If explaining things kills the image, how are we supposed to process our thoughts? Like, are we supposed to just sit in literal mute silence when a friend tells us a weird dream?
No, it's not about mute silence. It's about speaking the language of the image itself. Instead of jumping to labels like death anxiety, you stay inside the image. You ask, what was the texture of the snake's scales? What was the temperature of the room?
You respond with genuine curiosity about the sensory detail.
Right, you allow the imagination to elaborate on itself rather than shutting it down by solving it like a math equation.
You just let the snake be a snake. Give it space.
Exactly.
I want to take a breath here because this deep entanglement between our imagination, our community, and the physical world, it fundamentally shifts how we look at everything. but it especially shifts how we look at something incredibly heavy. Probably the most isolated act a human being can commit.
You're talking about suicide.
Right. It's a very heavy transition. But if we accept Hillman's premise that the soul is shared, what does a self-inflicted death actually mean?
If we truly accept that your soul belongs partly to the world, to the anima mundi, then suicide can no longer be viewed as just an individual right or a purely private affair.
Now, the sources are careful to acknowledge the medical model has virtues, of course. First, do no harm is vital for keeping people safe in a crisis. But Hillman argues the medical model fails to understand that death is a profound soul matter, not just a biological event.
When we treat suicide merely as a medical crisis, we miss the immense cosmic weight of what happened. To address this, Hillman proposes something incredibly provocative. He suggests a symbolic community court for suicide.
Which is not a legal body to forbid it or punish anyone.
No, not at all. It would be a ritual gathering. Its entire purpose would be to acknowledge that the world itself is intimately involved in this loss. Because your soul is entangled with the physical world, your departure literally tears the fabric of the community.
The text ties this to Alfred Adler's concept of Gemeinschaftsgefühl.
Social feeling.
Right. But Hillman takes Adler's idea and extends it beyond humans, out to the cosmos. He says we must feel deeply for the suffering of the soil, the air, and even the manufactured styrofoam cup on your desk. We have a cosmic dependence on these things. They hold part of our soul.
And in recognizing that, we have to face a hard truth. The heart of the modern world is broken. We are surrounded by environmental degradation, anorexic architecture, and social fragmentation.
But Hillman suggests that heartbreak is exactly where love enters.
Yes, to heal, we must practice praising ordinary things. We must re-enchant the world by paying deep attention to the mundane, like a pair of warm wool socks or a worn-in leather baseball glove.
But how does praising a sock heal the soul?
Because when you stop seeing those socks as just dead matter to consume, and instead notice the weave, the warmth, the care that went into them, you give them their soul back. You acknowledge their place in the anima mundi.
You realize you aren't floating in an empty void. You're anchored by a million tiny relationships.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? From the dying trees to the wool socks, what does this actually mean for the listener walking to work tomorrow?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it means our entire orientation needs to shift. We are not isolated, heroic egos trying to survive in a dead universe. We are necessary participants in a living, suffering world that desperately needs our attention and our praise.
And that idea of a ritual court for suicide is so incredibly radical because it bypasses the entire modern political debate. It steps completely out of the bodily autonomy versus state control argument. Instead, it asks you to realize that you are so deeply connected to the world that your death actually requires the world to bear witness. You are not alone because your soul is part of the world's soul.
That is the ultimate cure for the narcissism of modern psychology. To realize your heartbreak is the world's heartbreak, and your healing is the world's healing.
What a profound journey we've been on today. We've moved from seeing the city as just a traffic spreadsheet to seeing it as a living soul. We've walked through the Japanese strolling garden to see that individuality only exists in community. We've learned to protect our imagination by speaking the language of the image. And we've discovered our heartbreak is what connects us to the world.
It demands that we finally look out the window rather than just endlessly into the mirror.
Exactly. So I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over today as you go about your routine. If James Hillman is right, and yourself isn't just something locked inside your skull, but is actually made up of your community, your city, and the everyday objects around you, what neglected piece of your environment is quietly waiting for you to notice it, praise it, and give it its soul back today?